Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. My name's Tim Jacob. I'm the director of the Traveler Program at Reach the World. And we're so excited to have you here today as part of our Explorer program. We are here today again with Colin, who is triumphantly back from his expedition to Antarctica. And I'm very, very excited to turn things over to him. I want to just remind you that we're recording this so that we can share it on Colin's expedition homepage for some of the classrooms that weren't able to join us. So if you'd prefer to have your camera off, that's fine. Just want to let you be aware of that. Without any further ado, I think the last time that we spoke with Colin, he was standing on the shores of a beautiful stretch of water at the bottom of South America. And I want to turn it over to him and let him give us an update on where he's been since then.
Yeah, so good to see all you guys again. I think the last time I spoke to you guys was actually in Buenos Aires. So I was not yet in Ushuaia. So it's been a while. And in the last 2 weeks, I guess it's been, I've seen a lot more than even I expected. So just to kind of run through where I've been and what I've been doing. First, I flew down to Ushuaia, like I mentioned, which is this town on the very bottom of Tierra del Fuego, which is the southern tip of South America. And it's a little town that's also a Navy base. And so Argentina bases a lot of their naval infrastructure at the bottom of the world down there. So they go through the Falkland Islands and over to Antarctica, and they run research operations from there. And then I hopped on the boat, the World Explorer. I think I posted some photos of it in my profile on my journey. But it was a pretty large boat. There was about 150 people on board. And, you know, we spent 2 days sailing across the Drake Passage. Most of that time was filled with lectures by the scientists that were on board, and a lot of time just relaxing and trying to avoid getting seasick, just because the Drake Passage is the roughest seas on the entire planet. And then we got to Antarctica. And when I first got there, the first place we stopped was a place called Deception Island, which is a whaling station. And Deception Island is actually an active volcano. And so the whaling station was actually destroyed by the volcanic eruption back in the 60s. And so when you land there, you can see all of these old buildings that are just destroyed, and there's no way to go and rebuild, and it's just not worth it to anybody, especially since whaling is illegal now. So it's just left in the state that it was in, 5 decades ago. But even when I got there, I wasn't totally blown away. The landscape is this massive hill with snow everywhere. There's not really glaciers or anything like that, but it's very deep snow. When you're walking, you can wind up stepping in and sinking up to around your waist, just because you can never tell how deep it's going to be. But even then, I wasn't totally blown away, just because I didn't know what to expect, and it kind of reminded me of some of the snowy landscapes I'd seen even in Middle America. But then we got back on the boat, and we sailed another 70 miles south to get to Antarctica itself. And I went to bed for most of that time, just because it was a little bit choppy, and there was not that much else to do in that time. The sun doesn't set until about 11:30 down there at this time, just because it's so far south and it's getting towards summer. And then when the sun rose again at about 3:30 in the morning, we woke up, and I looked out the window, and I just noticed that we were basically sailing on land. There was so much ice in the water that you couldn't even tell that it was water at all. And looking around, you could just see these massive mountains that just fall right into the ocean. There's these big blue glaciers everywhere, and you can see penguins jumping out of the water and seals sleeping on some of the floes of ice. And there was one little research station that was abandoned, sitting on an iceberg near us, and I had to pick my jaw up off the floor, because it was the single most beautiful place I'd ever seen. And I've been to all 7 continents at this point now. So of anywhere in the world, I truly think that Antarctica is the most beautiful. but we spent the next 9 days basically floating around in that area. We'd go through different islands, different channels, and every morning we would wake up and have a buffet breakfast. The food was actually really good on the boat. They had some Argentine chefs who would do a buffet breakfast every morning, and they'd even have an omelet station if you wanted. And then we'd spend a little bit of time getting ready, doing a briefing on where we'd be going, hop on a little Zodiac boat, and then cruise around through all the icebergs for the next hour or so. And then we'd land on the ice, and we could see penguins and seals and icebergs going past, and pretty much whatever we wanted to do over the next couple of hours. And then we'd head back to the boat, have lunch, maybe have a lecture by a historian or a biologist on the things we'd been seeing. And then in the afternoon, we go out on another excursion. And then we'd head back, and we would have another lecture over cocktails on the boat and have dinner. And then you'd wind up going to bed because it was a pretty full day. We were walking around and cruising around all day. And when you're on those Zodiacs, you don't realize, but you have to use your stomach so much just to stay on and stay balanced. And so you'd be sore, actually. And that was kind of the whole trip. We'd go as far south as possible to the point where it never really got dark. We got to do a couple random fun things. One night we actually took a boat onto a little part of the continent of Antarctica, and they gave us a sleeping bag, which had a waterproof shell, the regular sleeping bag, and then a fleece sack that you basically tie over yourself. And then we spent the night just sleeping in the middle of the snow. And you could hear glaciers breaking apart next to us, and penguins would be walking around next to you. And then in the morning, we just went back. And then the other really cool thing we did was a polar plunge, where we got as far south as we were going to go, and we pulled up into this bay, and they tied a rope around our waists so that if we passed out from the shock, they could reel us back in like fish. And then we just jumped into the ocean, and the water was 30 degrees. The only reason it wasn't frozen was because the salt in it made it so that it couldn't freeze until it was about 29 degrees. And spent a couple of seconds paddling around, and immediately turned around and got back out and dumped a bunch of hot water on myself. And yeah, that was kind of the whole trip. I mean, it was a beautiful 9 days of just amazing wildlife and amazing scenery, and I can't say enough good things about what an experience it was.
Wow, Colin, that sounds amazing. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned that there were some scientists on the ship and some people who are working on the ship to help the people who are visiting Antarctica understand or explore the continent in a different way?
Right. So the boat is owned by a place, well, it's chartered rather by a company called Cork Expeditions, and they have a crew of about 30 people who support everybody on board the boat with the expeditions that they do and the itinerary that they're going on. And they have biologists and anthropologists and historians and just adventure guides who have spent their life going to Antarctica. I mean, some of these people have been going back for 20 years every summer. And then the boat itself is owned by a Portuguese company. And so it's registered in an area called Madeira in Portugal. And so the people that work on the boat itself, the sailors, the seamen, the cooks, the janitorial staff, they all work for the boat. And so they're mostly Argentines and Chileans and a few Europeans and a few Americans, actually, and some people from Honduras and a lot of people from the Philippines, actually, were working on board. But the boat, the expedition crew from Cork were mostly Canadian, American, and Argentine. So there's a large group of people who are supporting us at any given state of this cruise.
Was there anything that you noticed that is sort of a special job that someone on the ship would have to do because you were in such a remote, inhospitable place like Antarctica? Is there any difference between a ship that's operating in Antarctica versus someplace that's maybe a little bit warmer?
Yeah, so the big thing was just navigation. And so the captain we got to go and see the bridge sometimes, but they'd put a little sign outside that said, dangerous navigation, please stay out. And so at times, because there are so many people, or there's so many rocks in the water and it gets very shallow and there's so much ice, they would have a very intense navigation course where they basically just need to um, maneuver themselves around these areas that may not look dangerous, but really actually are. There was one point where we were going through this very narrow channel called the Lemaire Channel. And on either side of us, it was only about half a mile wide. And then there were mountains that were 4,000 feet tall on either side of us, just going straight into the water. So it was very intense landscape. But what we were told was that under the water was very similar landscape with jetties that came up within a foot of the surface. And so the captain would maneuver us all the way to the very end of this channel. And when we got there, we realized that the whole exit of the channel was blocked by sea ice. And we had what's called a Class 1A boat. So it was rated to be able to get through this ice. It had very thick steel walls, but the ice was just so thick and so strong that if we had gone through it, it would have just punctured it and we would have sunk. And so the guide had to, the captain rather, had to actually turn the boat around in this very narrow channel. And it took about 10 minutes, just going back and forth, like somebody trying to turn a car around on a narrow street. And then we had to sail all the way back through that same channel and go around the other side of the island to get through it. And so navigation was very, very difficult. And it was actually quite impressive what they were able to do.
Yeah, we had talked last time about how the Drake Passage and the choppy waters of that sea are particularly dangerous sometimes. And we didn't even get into how dangerous navigation could be once you actually arrived at the Antarctic Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. And we got very lucky with the Drake Passage. There was bright blue skies all around us, and the guides were saying that happens only once, maybe 5 times a year, and we got 4 days of it on our trip. And so during the Drake Passage, the waves never got larger than, I think, 30 feet was the biggest, which is still very large, but not for the Drake Passage. And the boat was able to handle it very easily. But even then, as it went down, you'd hear a big crash as it landed in the water, and every part of the boat would shudder. There'd be creaking and shuddering, and it's meant to do that. It needs to be able to move so that it doesn't break. But it's a little off-putting.
Well, that sounds really incredible, Colin, and we're so glad that you had that experience and you're able to share it with us. I want to give our classrooms who are with us today a chance to ask some of their questions to you, because I know that while you've been away, they've been following the pictures and articles that you've been posting. And the fun part about this is that they can ask some of the questions now directly to you now that you've been there and back, and have an answer to share with them. So why don't we start with Miss Latore's class. I'm going to unmute you real quick, and if there's somebody there who'd like to ask a question to Colin, please come on up to the camera and ask away.
When you were on the boat and you were scared, did you ever have second thoughts about being an explorer?
No, never. I mean, I think that having a little bit of discomfort is 100% worth the experiences that you get by pushing through it. And I wouldn't be able to have the memories that I had if I had ever decided not to do something just because it was a little bit scary. And we had a really good team that were, we did drills on what to do for the lifeboats and everything. So there's never a point where I felt like we were unsafe. When we were there, we were reading a lot of books about some of the people that came before us. And there was a person named Ernest Shackleton who actually, like I just said, we couldn't go through that ice because it was too dangerous. Back in the 1900s, he actually went through the ice and it sunk his boat. And he survived on the ice for 17 months in Antarctica. And so I like to think that if somebody can do something like that, that I can, go on a cruise.
Thankfully, you didn't have to. That was a great question. Let's go now to Miss Shear's class in Kentucky. If any student would like to ask Colin a question, please, I'm going to unmute you and feel free to ask away.
Casey, you have a question?
Yeah, was it colder than you expected?
It was warmer than I expected. So we were outfitted with a big waterproof parka and waterproof ski pants. And then we had a base layer or a mid layer of like fleece and then some wool underwear to keep us warm the whole time. But there were days when it got up to 50 degrees actually. And I had to take off all of my layers just because it was way too hot to wear them. But on the cold days, even then, I would say it got to around 15 degrees or so. But wearing all of those layers made it feel totally comfortable. The bad part was when we got wet. And because on the bad weather was so choppy, you'd be sitting on the Zodiacs just trying to stay on board because you have to sit on the side of the boat because there's no seats. And when we went over a wave, we'd all get splashed and it would roll right off the waterproof parka and snow pants, but if it hit your face, it was freezing. And then the wind was really strong as well. And so that made it feel colder than it was. But I was expecting it to be much colder. And we had 4 days where it was just beautiful weather.
It's great. Good question. Thank you. It's also worth noting that it's a popular time to visit Antarctica around these months because it is summer in Antarctica and it's probably the warmest it's going to get there all year. Is that right, Colin?
Yeah, it'll get a little bit warmer around December, January, February, but it's never going to get all that warm. It gets warmer every year, but it's never going to be balmy.
All right, great question, Ms. Shear's class. Ms. Latore's class, let's go back to you. Would somebody else like to ask Colin a question?
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you tell us if you have a map of where exactly you went in Antarctica?
Yeah.
By the Middle Sea? Is there an area that you actually stayed in and studied in?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pull up a map and share my screen for you guys. I don't have an official one from the boat, but I can try to pull up some specifics in terms of where I went. But we started off in Ushuaia, like I said, and then sailed across the Drake Passage to the South Shetland Islands. So once this loads, I will share my screen.
And just to be really clear, this was the entire time that you were in Antarctica, you were sleeping and eating and living on the ship, right? Except for the night where you slept on the continent?
Yeah, so Antarctica is governed by, it's called the Antarctic Treaty, and then tourism companies are governed by what's called IATO. And there are these regulations and agreements between everybody that goes to Antarctica. It basically says that you are not allowed to develop anything on Antarctica. You're not allowed to it's not going to let me share my screen without restarting the meeting. But you can actually see a map of where I went on the one of the notes that I did. And I'll be sure to share some of those as well. But we went to a place called the South Shetland Islands, which was 75 miles off the coast of Antarctica. And that's actually a place that was discovered well before Antarctica was. And so people would use that as a whaling station, as far back as the 1600s, 1700s. And it wasn't until the 1850s that people actually set foot on Antarctica itself. And then we cruised down the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, which, if you have a map handy, kind of goes up like a tentacle from the continent itself. And we did about 9 days down there, and then went straight back up the Drake Passage. So we never really got that far into Antarctica, but any further down than where I was is really just a barren desert. It's just the peninsula that really has a lot of diversity in its landscape.
Is it also the case, Colin, that even though on a map a lot of the area around the Antarctic Peninsula looks like open water, it's not water you could go through in a ship because it's so full of ice, or it's frozen over, or in some way blocked from passage?
Yeah, so that depends on the season. You can really only go to Antarctica between November and March, because that's the only time that the sea ice is melted enough to allow ships through. But during the winter, Antarctica actually doubles in size, fully doubles, because enough of the sea surrounding it freezes solid. And it's that ice can be up to 18 thick, and so it's just impossible to get through in the winter. And there's actually somebody on board our boat who, on his own, had built a sailboat and sailed it down to Antarctica, allowed it to freeze for the winter, and then spent the winter living on the ice next to his sailboat. And in the spring, he sailed back. So,
Wow.
So yeah, it's a pretty intense water area around the continent.
Colin, I'd love to share a question from our chat bar on the side of the screen real quick. Students were wondering, what is your job and how do you get to do what you do for a living, and what skills do you need to do what you do?
Yeah, so to do what I do, you really just need to have a curiosity about the world and a desire to visit it and a desire to share it with others. My job is I work for a travel agency, and so I plan trips for other people, and I'm also working on conservation and environmental initiatives for our company. So I work on fundraising for causes in the destinations that we go to. For example, if somebody wants to go to Antarctica, I would help raise money for causes that fight global warming, for example, just to ensure that people can visit these places in the future in the same state that they're in right now. I got this job because I actually went to school for the film industry in California. And when I got into it, I decided that it wasn't for me. And I bought a one-way ticket to the Philippines. And I emailed a writer whose book I had read. And this writer did a year overseas, and he worked for a magazine. And I sent him an email and I said, I really respect what you did. I admired your writing. If you're ever in Los Angeles, I'd love to, take you out to lunch and pick your brain a little bit about your career path. And I went to lunch with him, and I brought a portfolio of the stuff I had written myself. And we got along really well, and he liked my writing. And so he introduced me to his editors. And that's how I became a freelance travel writer. And I moved to the Philippines, and I moved to Australia and Vietnam, and I lived in New Zealand, and I lived in Europe. And then I decided to move to New York. And when I moved to New York, I decided to start looking into other jobs in the travel industry. And that led me to this travel agency. And because I had this experience living overseas, they hired me, and I've been working here for 4 years now.
All right, awesome. Let's go back to Miss Latore's class. I see a lot of hands up. Let's take another question.
Go ahead, quick, Sarah, quick, hurry. Did you guys do any underwater exploring, like in under?
The closest I got to going underwater was during that polar plunge when I jumped in, and I was too busy thinking about how cold I was to really look around. But there are other companies that do underwater exploration. There are some tour companies that allow you to go scuba diving. And because the water is so cold there, you actually have to wear what's called a dry suit, not even a wetsuit. It's a neoprene bag almost that you're in. And the only thing exposed to the water is your face. And, you know, after a couple of hours down there, your face is totally numb, but you can still manage to get warm again. There's actually somebody who does long distance swimming in Antarctica, and they swam a mile in temperature as cold as I jumped in. And in their book, they talk about it taking 2 hours to get their body temperature back up to normal. But if you want to do other underwater stuff, there are other ways, like I had said, and there's a boat that's going to launch next year, actually, for the same company that I went to Antarctica for. And that boat is going to be equipped with a submarine. And so people are actually going to be able to go underwater in a submarine to explore and see some of the animal life over there.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing way to see what's going on, because I know that there's a lot going on underneath the waves in Antarctica, as you referenced in your field note about nature, that even though at first sight it may seem like it's pretty quiet and desolate in Antarctica, the wildlife is all over the place. I would like to go back to Miss Shearer's class. I'm in the background trying to bring up a map that I can show up on the screen to support what you were just saying, Colin. But while we're doing that, let's go back to Miss Shearer's class and take another student question.
Okay, anybody got a question they'd like to ask? Kenna?
So, let's see here. What would you say would be your favorite thing from your journey?
Favorite thing from your journey. What would you say would be your favorite thing?
Favorite thing would be that first moment when I got up on the observation deck and I just saw all of Antarctica spread out around me for 360-degree views. But beyond that, I would say it's the night camping on the continent. And I don't know if any of you guys are very into camping, but for me, I like to go camping as much as possible. And I think the big thing of it is just how alone with your thoughts you can be. And in Antarctica, you know, you truly are alone in every direction. So there was a lot of introspection that went on that night. And I hope that everybody would get a chance to experience that as well someday.
All right, great question. Before we go back to Miss Latore's class, I think I've got a map that I can share. I'm going to bring it up real quick, and maybe, Colin, while it's up, we can do like a 2-minute narration of how you got from New York to Antarctica and back to the mystery location where you are now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can see in New York, obviously up there, I flew to Houston on a flight, and then I had a 10-hour layover, and then I took a night flight from Houston over to Buenos Aires down in South America, south of the equator. And that flight was 10 hours long. And so I got there at 10 in the morning, and then I was there for 2 days, and then flew from there to Ushuaia, down on the bottom of the continent.
There it is.
And that was another 6-hour flight. And then from there, we got on the Drake Passage, and we sailed through the Beagle Channel, which is what that little line is you can see next to Ushuaia. And then we sailed for 2 days down through the Drake Passage to a place called Deception Island. And you can kind of see it next to the word Montalva. If you zoom in on Base Presidente Eduardo. So that little island with a circle in the middle is Deception Island, and that's a volcano. So that circle in the middle is the caldera where the volcano erupted out of and filled with water. And then from there, we sailed south to the continent itself. And then we followed the coastline basically all the way through past base Yelcho. And then once we got to base Yelcho, we turned around and sailed back north. So we didn't actually go all that far south, all things considered. But there's really not that much else down there in Antarctica. It's just such a barren and ice-covered area. Going any further south is what a lot of people do to get across what's called the Antarctic Circle. And it's kind of a bucket list thing. It's more just something people do to say they've done it than to see anything specific that they couldn't see any further north.
Okay. Cool. Well, that's quite a journey, and I think following it on a map like that shows everybody just how far you've traveled, and then they can use their imagination and take that reverse journey all the way back to the United States, where you are now.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Let's go back to Miss Latore's class. We've got time for another question if you'd like.
Now that you're an explorer, are you part of the Explorer Club in New York?
Well, there is an Explorers Club, and I actually went to an event there just last week. I'm trying to get into it, but it's very difficult. Just to give you a sense, the Explorers Club has been around since the 1800s or so, and they have what's called flag expeditions, when if somebody's going somewhere very unique, they carry the Explorers Club flag with them. And so the Explorers Club flag was part of the first expedition with Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. They carried it with them the first time Mount Everest was ever climbed. And it was carried by Neil Armstrong on the mission to the moon for the first time. It was carried by somebody, I forget the name, who went to the Marianas Trench, the very bottom of the ocean, for the very first time. So there's a lot of history in the Explorers Club, and I'm hoping they'll let me in someday.
It's an excellent place to research, students, if you want to learn more about other famous explorers and some of the most recent places where current scientists and explorers are off doing their work.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. Let's go back to Ms. Shear's class. We have time for another question.
Okay, guys, anybody got a question they'd like to ask? We probably have time for one more from our class. Anybody? Well, I have a question. So your company, Colin, are they gonna eventually have packages where people can go kind of like on a journey to Antarctica? And if so, how much is that gonna range, or is it more for the conservation part of the trip, or?
Yeah, so my company doesn't put together the packages themselves. We actually just design the trips for people. So let's say somebody wanted to go to Antarctica. What we would do is we'd put together an itinerary for them that could include Buenos Aires, or maybe it includes Chile, Santiago, Patagonia, Atacama. And then we book the hotels for them, and we'll work with companies like Quark, which is who organized the boat to Antarctica, to include it all together. So we're not necessarily putting together the packages so much as doing the logistics of the trip itself. But those trips can run, as much as, if you really wanted to do something very expensive, stay in a very nice suite on board the boat, those can run as much as $30,000 per person. But if you wanted to do it in a more affordable way to go to Antarctica, for example, you could go to McMurdo Station, which is a research base, and they have jobs there that you can do for the summer. And, in that case, you'd actually be paid to go. So there's a lot of ways to go to Antarctica, and it just involves deciding what's important to you and what sort of comfort levels you want to go do, and how if you want to make it happen, you can make it happen.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Colin, and a great question from Ms. Shear's class. My colleague Brianna added to our group chat on the side window another link to a great organization if you are a high school student and you really are interested in Antarctica and polar regions and would like to find a way to visit and see some of these things that Colin is describing. This organization called Students on Ice is a fantastic thing to look into. All right, I see hands up again in Miss Latore's class. You are unmuted.
How do you connect with your friends and family? Because I don't think there's any Wi-Fi in Antarctica.
There actually is. You'd be surprised. So there are enough satellites nowadays that you can actually connect to Wi-Fi through the satellite. And it's expensive because it's very specialized equipment. And so I personally wasn't able to do it. But for people who needed to be in touch, you can do it. My dad was actually on the trip with me and actually bought a little bit of internet just to use to do some work. So it's not as far-fetched as you think.
That's pretty amazing. It's a fantastic question from Miss Latore's class. Thankfully, the limited availability of internet allowed Colin to send us some updates and some photos from Argentina for sure, and to collect his things so that he could post more to his expedition homepage when he returned. So I want to encourage all of our classes before we start to wind things down here to keep checking in with Colin's expedition homepage. He's got a couple more articles he's going to post about reflections in the aftermath of his journey. And if you have any questions that come up after this talk or something that's sort of been nagging on you that you didn't want to ask him live, make sure that you email Reach the World and we'll pass it along to Colin, because he's got all sorts of great experience and is always happy to answer your questions. Let's take, is there one more question from Ms. Shear's class, or are you guys okay?
I think we're good.
All right. Well,
We
thank you so.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
We have really enjoyed following his expedition. This is the first time we've done Reach the World, and we really like the program. So thank you so much.
Great to hear. I'm glad that I was able to make it at least somewhat interesting for you guys.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm gonna unmute Miss Latore's class as well, and I think this is a great chance if everyone would join me in saying a big thank you to Colin for joining us today and for sharing his experiences.
Goodbye, senorita.
All on the way back.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. Good talking to you.
All right, so we are in the final week or so of Colin's expedition. He is back in the United States and is going to be sharing some final thoughts and photos and videos from his experience. Thank you so much for joining us on this video call today. Colin, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for being a Reach the World explorer. I know I learned a lot from you, and I know the students did as well. So happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
See you next time.
Bye.